Okay, Mel, one topic that I find really interesting, and I'd love to talk to some Muslims about actually, if we ever get the opportunity, is about the role of Mary in the Qur'an, and in particular the two passages, one in Surah 3, the other in Surah 19, which talk about Mary's upbringing at the temple. And I wonder what Muslims really think of this. On the face of it, it seemed like a completely useless piece of information. If your vision is that Muhammad is at an Abrahamic shrine that was built by Abraham and Ishmael down in the Hijaz, preaching monotheism to a load of pagans, what possible, if you tell them, oh, by the way, there were all these other prophets, okay, it might be kind of interesting. If you start telling them the story about Jesus and the virgin birth and so on, that might be interesting, but it's just another story. It doesn't really mean a great deal if you don't come from the background where that matters. But to actually start talking about Jesus' mother and where she spent her childhood seems to me like the most useless piece of information. I just don't know what Muslims think that a Bedouin or a desert dweller or somebody a trader in an oasis town would have done with that information about where Mary was raised back in the 7th century. However, I am in the position of being able to explain to you and to the world exactly what it means. And I'm basing this in large part on an article by Guillaume D. D-Y-E. I forget the full name. It's got quite a complicated and obscure name, but I think the word
Guillaume D.
I think it's got the word hypertextuality in the title, so that I should be able to find it from that. So anyway, the point is that the Qur'an is borrowing from a Christian tradition, first set out, as far as we know, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, which says, which is an apocryphal infancy gospel, and that tells us that, or makes a point that Mary grew up in the temple, and Mary was within the temple for a particular reason. It is there as an allegory for Mary's womb being the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of a new covenant. To set a little bit of background to this, in the Old Testament, God's covenant with the Israelites was made real in the stone tablets, which were placed inside the golden Ark of the Covenant. And in Deuteronomy chapter 12, the Israelites are told, when you get into the Promised Land, there will be a particular place, and you will put the Ark of the Covenant there. And God's presence, which is in the Ark of the Covenant and with the Israelites in the wilderness, that will then transfer to that place. And other parts of the Torah talk about making the Hajj to that place, and the 3 Hajj feasts, the feasts of pilgrimage that the Israelites are told they have to perform 3 times a year. Well, for Christianity, Jesus represents a new covenant. So Mary's womb would represent the ark of that new covenant, and it is for that symbolism that Mary, the Proto-Evangelium of James, says that Mary grew up in the Jerusalem temple. She grows up on the very spot where the Ark of the Covenant had once stood to represent this. Now I don't say for one moment whether this is true or not. I've got no views on them. I have no idea where Mary grew up. But my point is, that's why the story is told. It's told to put Mary in the place where the Ark of the Covenant is, to represent Jesus, the fruit of her womb, as being the new covenant between man and God.
I'm just going to jump in on that. So the Ark of the Covenant originally was a container, a box if you like, where the 10 Commandments were stored. And that was God's word inside this container. And so Jesus inside the womb of Mary would then be the equivalent of that, so the new covenant within the ark. It was interesting when you spoke to me yesterday about the idea of dealing with this topic, because I saw this verse in Psalm 46:5, and I'll just quote it to you, which is very relevant to this, and it's like a fulfillment of it, is God is in the midst of her. And that's really the idea, really, that you're presenting of the new Ark of the Covenant. God is in the midst of her, that is, Jesus is in her womb. Would you like to continue from there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just wonder, how on earth Islam would have explained this otherwise, other than the other than the presence of Mary in the temple. Why else would it matter that she was in the temple if it was not to represent this illusion? And it's not original, by the way. This idea of Mary in the temple, Mary representing the Ark of the Covenant, because it's referred to in one of the homilies of Jacob of Saru. Now, Jacob of Saru is a Syriac preacher, a churchman of the, I think it was the 6th century.
I think.
Oh, okay.
Or, no, you may be right. Maybe the 6th century actually.
But we know for a fact that the Qur'an author, or one of the Qur'an authors, was familiar with Jacob of Saru, because Jacob of Saru wrote down the story of the sleepers in the cave and included certain details, such as the watcher at the door of the cave, and the sleepers having money in their possession, and he includes these little details that find their way into the Qur'an. So we can be fairly certain that the Qur'an author was familiar with at least one of the works of Jacob of Saru, and it seems to me that this is a further example of where the Qur'an author is familiar with this Christian iconography.
You mentioned there was a part of that passage in the Qur'an that you referred to with the sleepers, where they must have known Jacob of Saru for that illusion to be made. It's just hinted at in relation to the money.
The money is important. It's one of what I call the inconsequential details of the Qur'an, where the Qur'an mentions that one of the sleepers had money with him, and he went to buy some food. But that is a completely meaningless, well, not meaningless, but it's a completely irrelevant detail. So some guy had some money and went to buy some food. It doesn't take the story any further at all. In Jacob of Saru's version, it does take the story forward, because in Jacob of Saru's version, it's the emperor's face appearing on the coin that alerts the town people to the fact that these are people who've been asleep in a cave for 100 years, and they say that guy hasn't been the emperor for the last 100 years, and so rather like a science fiction time traveller film, this is what leads to the discovery that they've not been asleep for a few hours, they've actually been asleep for 100 years.
This is a sort of
I just mentioned that there is also the visual metaphor that the emperor who had been persecuting the sleepers, which caused them to hide in the cave to begin with. The emperor who'd been persecuting them, he's now dead. He's long gone. He's dead in his cold grave. But now that by the time the sleepers have emerged, the Roman Empire has converted to Christianity, and so it's a sign of faith in God, and will be resurrected into a new realm.
That's an illusion that only people in an Aramaic or Syriac-speaking land could possibly know about. Certainly not in Arabia Deserta, the uninhabited Arabia, where you find, for example, most of the Hijaz. So again, I would suggest that this is suggesting that the population that is being spoken to are way up north, or maybe again way down in the south in Yemen, but certainly not in the middle of Arabia, where hardly anyone lives, and they don't have access to libraries of ancient Syriac sources like.
There are only two possible explanations for the mention of the money in the Qur'an. One would be that the Qur'an author, or at least the author of that passage, was simply repeating facts without any kind of meaning or purpose. The other is that he was alluding to this, and he was assuming that the audience knew about it. I very much veer towards that latter explanation. I think that the Qur'an author knew what the money was signified, and he was assuming that his audience would also recognise the reference, because there's just simply no reason for mentioning it otherwise.
And possibly the audience are Syriac speakers as well. That's the other little detail out of that. So back to Mary.
Okay, well, actually, back to the Ark of the Covenant,
yeah.
Because in rabbinic thought, they've got this word called Shekinah, and this is a word that's come about. I don't think it's been used at the time that the Bible was written. In biblical times, it was a word that rabbinic Judaic thought used subsequently to describe the real presence of God. And the real presence of God might appear, for example, in a group of people praying. You might say, well, God is amongst us, particularly after the destruction of the temple. But it's also a word used by rabbinic scholars in the Talmud for the real presence of God with the Israelites in the wilderness, as a pillar of flame or a pillar of fire, or as a presence of the Ark of the Covenant, or when the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple, in the temple. So the word Shekinah has this very clear, very specific meaning in rabbinic thought of meaning God's presence, particularly, amongst other things, in relation to the Ark of the Covenant. And the Qur'an has exactly the same thing. The Qur'an uses a word Sakina, which is obviously similar, and it uses it in 4 separate occasions. 3 of them relate to strengthening somebody spiritually, like, for example, 2 people in a cave in Surah 9. But also, on the 4th occasion, it's used in particular in relation to the Ark of the Covenant. So I don't memorize these things, but in Surah 2, verse 248, there's a description of the Ark of the Covenant entering into the Promised Land, and it uses the word Sakina in relation to that. Now, translators of the Qur'an into English tend to translate it with some fairly, I think anodyne phrase like tranquility, a sense of calm. But it doesn't really, sense of calm doesn't capture it at all. A lot of these verses have a kind of martial element to it. The Shekinah, the tranquility, is also accompanied by armies of angels, armies of invisible, the host of invisible angels.
I was going to say that in the 7th and 8th century, the exilarchs, who are the Jewish leaders, would be considered the Shekinah. So wherever they were resident, there was the Spirit of God as well. And so that might have fed into that idea of you mentioned about people being strengthened by the Shekinah, so perhaps there's a link there. They obviously would have been aware of that, especially in Iraq, in Babylon, in Kufa, which is obviously connected with the writing of the Qur'ans in the early days. There were a lot of rabbinic schools in that area, like, for example, Surah being one of them. So I think there's definitely a lot of ideas being borrowed from Judaism, particularly on this one.
So, Surah 2, verse 248, the Qur'an talks about the Shekinah, the presence of God, being in the Ark of the Covenant. Surah 3, Surah 19 talk about Mary being in the temple, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. Ties in with my what I call the Jerusalem thesis, which is that the Qur'an author is putting all of his attention, all of his focus towards Jerusalem. None of this could have any meaning to people down in the Hijaz. It would mean nothing to them. It wouldn't have any purpose. But when you have these stories, and this is one of 28 different arguments that I put forward for the Jerusalem thesis. But when you put these arguments forward, it seems to me quite clear that when the Qur'an talks about the holy place of worship, it's talking about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like a thread that just runs throughout the whole of the Qur'an. Yeah. Every passage you look at comes down to the same geographical focus, which is Jerusalem as the holy place of worship.
Yeah, another sort of area of interest for me is the fact that the Qur'an uses the word grape and pearl spread throughout. And St. Ephraim uses those as symbols of Jesus. So what's interesting is by using the phrase grape, and there's obviously references to vines in the Qur'an, the vine in St. Ephraim's analogy would be Mary, once again, and Jesus being the fruit of the vine. It's very much like the concept of the Ark of the Covenant again. And what's interesting is, in Syriac, fruit of the vine was called Yalda da Jepeta, which has a double meaning in Syriac. It means fruit of the vine and child of the vine. So when Jesus talks about, I will not drink again this cup until I drink the child of the vine in my new kingdom. I'm paraphrasing just ever so slightly there. I would suggest that there are a lot of hidden symbols in the Qur'an that also back up your idea of the Ark of the Covenant. We have multiple references to fruit, such as grapes. There's multiple references to vines. We have references also to pearls.
Of course.
And a pearl, remember, a pearl is kept where? Where do you find a pearl? It's inside a shell, which again is that Shekinah idea. And in ancient times, who was pictured standing on a shell? Have you heard of, or have you seen the picture of Venus standing on the shell? Well, Venus is an alternative goddess to Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is associated with the Black Rock, according to St. John of Damascus.
There's a cunning connection there,
So
a hidden connection.
So perhaps how this got morphed here is they went for a black rock in Mecca because of these Shekinah connections with Jesus and Mary that got distorted, and they went down a pagan route away from the Christian and Jewish origins, you know. So
I was just thinking while you were talking that, of course, the theme of grapes and vines and vineyards and wine is, of course, runs throughout the New Testament, in particular the Gospels. It's an image that Jesus uses a great deal. Whenever anyone talks about grapes and vines in a religious context, you've got to think of Jesus.
Yeah, it's the person, of course, in the 4th century that really popularized this in the Syriac milieu would have been Saint Ephrem. He wrote over 400 hymns. He wrote millions of pages of poems, hymns, homilies, and really the whole Syriac culture was full of his metaphors, his images, and it was fitting that someone or some people who wrote the Qur'an would have borrowed from that and slipped them everywhere throughout the Qur'an. And part of my work is really to find those connections at the minute. This is something I'm working on with Vander Films, and there's an awful lot more to reveal next year as we delve into this. But I think this is going to be a very fruitful type of research.
Yes, I look forward to drinking deeply at the well of your knowledge on this. No, but seriously, I just wish that more Muslims were actually interested in reading the Qur'an instead of telling everybody else how wonderful, how it's God's word and it's the voice speech of God and it's the most holy, precious book that's ever been. I wish more Muslims would actually read it and actually engage with it and try and work out what the references to the Ark of the Covenant, what the references to Mary in the temple mean. Because it seems to me that this is a fascinating topic, it's very relevant, and it's a topic which is almost exclusively being spoken about seriously by non-Muslims. Muslims themselves just seem to have a refusal to look and engage with the material in a sensible way.
I think a large part of that is because they believe the book is a divine book, whereas from our point of view we see it as a very human book with hundreds of human fingerprints all over it and lots of history behind it.
But even if it was divine, all the more reason for reading it.
Yeah,
if you really thought that this is the God's ultimate statement to mankind, surely you'd want to try and tease these things out. You'd want to understand them more. But there just seems to be a refusal to look at it. Anyway, there we go. Nice chatting to you.
Nice talking to you.
Okay. Bye, Mel.
Cheers.